from the 20th century nature writer Loren Eiseley. I find myself using that word more often, that phrase, 20th century, but he's a beautiful, gifted naturalist, and this is from his book, The Immense Journey. On the edge of a little glade with one long, crooked branch extending across it, I had sat down to rest with my back against a stump. Through accident, I was concealed from the glade, although I could see into it perfectly. The sun was warm there, and the murmurs of forest life blurred softly away in my sleep. When I awoke, dimly aware of some commotion and outcry in the clearing, the light was slanting down through the pines in such a way that the glade was lit like some vast cathedral. I could see the dust motes of wood pollen in the long shaft of light. And there, on the extended branch, sat an enormous raven with a red and squirming nestling in his beak. The sound that awoke me was the outraged cries of the nestling's parents, who flew helplessly in circles about the clearing. The sleek black monster was indifferent to them. He gulped, wetted his beak on the dead branch a moment, and sat still. Up to that point, the little tragedy had followed the usual pattern. But suddenly, out of all that area of woodland, a soft sound of complaint began to arise. Into the glade fluttered small birds of half a dozen varieties, drawn by the anguished outcries of the tiny parents. No one dared to attack the raven, but they cried there in some instinctive common misery, the bereaved and the unbereaved. The glade filled with their soft rustling and their cries. They fluttered as though to point their wings at the murderer. There was a dim, intangible ethic he had violated, that they knew. He was a bird of death. And he, the murderer, the black bird at the heart of life, sat on there, glistening in the common light, formidable, unmoving, unperturbed, untouchable. The sighing died. It was then I saw the judgment. It was the judgment of life against death. I will never see it again so forcefully presented. I will never hear it again in notes so tragically prolonged. For in the midst of protest, they forgot the violence. There in that clearing, the crystal note of a song sparrow lifted hesitantly in the hush. And finally, after painful fluttering, another took up the song, and then another, the song passing from one bird to another, doubtfully at first, as though some evil thing were being slowly forgotten. Then suddenly they took heart and sang from many throats, joyously together, as birds are known to sing. They sang because life is sweet and sunlight beautiful. They sang under the brooding shadow of the raven. In simple truth, they had forgotten the raven, for they were singers of life and not of death. A Lutheran colleague of mine once said to me, with genuine wonder and sympathy in her voice, "It must really be hard being a Unitarian Universalist minister at Easter." Of course, I replied, "It's always hard to be a Unitarian Universalist minister, but it's always also exciting and challenging, and deeply fulfilling, and I wouldn't trade it for any job in the world." But I wondered, what unique difficulty did she imagine me having? Did she think I would find myself standing here on Easter morning all dressed up with nothing to say? She knew that I had a lot to say. That wasn't my problem. If anything, my problem was the opposite. I had too much to say, and that I might feel I had to say it all on this one day. She told me that for her as a Christian, minister preaching to a Christian congregation, every Sunday is a little Easter. So there's not that pressure to get it all said on one day. In traditional Christian churches, the spirit of Easter is distributed throughout the year in little pieces, like brightly colored jelly beans marking the way. In most Unitarian Universalist congregations, that's not the case. So Easter takes on a paradoxically heightened significance. After all, it may be our one chance to say something about Jesus. Now, as you know, or you'll discover, I'm not shy about saying things about Jesus, but sometimes Unitarian Universalists have used the nature festival approach as a way of avoiding the hard human questions and the specifically Christian challenges and invitations of Easter. Unitarian Universalists often shy away from the traditional Easter stories altogether, exhibiting a reflex reaction, reactivity that one of my your colleagues refers to as cross cringe. So Charles Wesley's classic Easter hymn, Christ the Lord is risen today, becomes in Samuel Longfellow's Unitarian version, Lo, the earth awakes again. Now don't get me wrong, I love Longfellow's lyrics, and there are good reasons, of course, for resisting what all too often has become a kind of fundamentalist Christian entombment of the spirit of Easter. But I think that we risk missing an important and life-giving message if when we avoid Easter altogether in all its mythical richness. At the very least, as a matter of intellectual honesty and religious integrity, we ought to acknowledge that the Easter story can be understood in a variety of ways that are true to the principles of liberal religion. The story transcends the boundaries and confines of any one religious tradition. You might say that Easter is too important to be left to the Christians. We should all know the story. From the very beginning, the story has been told in many ways and in different voices. When the specifically Christian dimension of Easter gets confused with or collapsed into the nature festival, it can lead to embarrassing results. You've probably heard the story about the UU Sunday school teacher sitting in a circle with her young charges talking about this holiday. What can you tell me about Easter? She asks. Oh, the Easter bunny brings us jelly beans and chocolate, and we go to our grandparents for dinner, says one of the children. Yes, that's right, and what else can you tell me? We dye eggs, and then the Easter bunny hides them, and we hunt for them. That's a lovely tradition, but Easter is also a religious holiday. Anyone know about that part? Is it the one where we bring flowers to church and exchange them? Not exactly, she says. I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with Jesus. Stone silence. Who died on the cross? No response. And on the third day, a little boy raises his hand. I know. On the third day, his disciples went to his tomb. Yes, that's right. And they saw that the stone had been moved away. Yes, you've got it. And Jesus came out. Go on. And the little boy concludes triumphantly, if he sees his shadow, it means we'll have 6 more weeks of winter. Well, let's hope not. It's a sunny day. Let's hope not. More seriously, though, I remember a comment made by Bill Schultz in his 2006 Berry Street lecture addressed to gathered Unitarian Universalist ministers. Bill had been was the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association from 1985 to 1983, after which he served for 13 years as director of the U.S. chapter of Amnesty International. The title of his powerful address was, What Torture Has Taught Me. Obviously drawing upon his experience working with political prisoners. At one point in his talk, he recalled seeing a cartoon. He didn't say where it was from, but I suspect it was the New Yorker, in which the signs outside an Episcopalian church and a Unitarian Universalist church were both visible on a opposite street corner. publicizing their upcoming service. It was Easter, and the title of the Episcopal rector's sermon was "The Truth and Power of the Risen Christ." While across the street, the Unitarian Universalist was preaching a sermon entitled "Upsy Daisy." An upsy-daisy theology, said Bill, fails what he called the torture test. In other words, it lacks a certain religious and moral seriousness and depth because it fails to engage the true level of human suffering and violence and injustice in the world. And it does not succeed in offering any real resources of hope and healing. It does not recognize or acknowledge the black bird of death at the heart of life. We cannot hope to speak a healing word with a theology that does not take into its very heart the pain and sorrow and trauma of all who suffer, especially the most marginalized and oppressed in our society today. A sunshiny and upsy-daisy theology begins to look a lot like the product of privilege, a narcissistic spirituality that has closed off its heart and soul to the wider world. So in our current climate, both meteorological and political, we may question the adequacy of a purely nature-based approach. And we're given an opportunity to explore other dimensions of the story. So I want to pick up on the Sunday school teacher's hint that Easter has something to do with Jesus and follow where that leads. For the early followers of Jesus, the resurrection was not a separate thing that they could talk about as one thing among others. Rather, it was the all-encompassing atmosphere into which they had been swept up. It was the very air they breathed, the spirit in which they lived and moved and had their being. One can't truthfully speak of resurrection without, in some sense, participating in its very reality and helping to constitute that reality. It's not an objective thing out there or back there in history that you can point to. The New Testament scholar Marcus Borg used to criticize what he called the Big Bang theory of Easter, that there was this thing called the resurrection that exploded on the scene back 2,000 years ago. All the really interesting stuff happened back then, and we have these trace memories. No, the resurrection, if it means anything at all, it has to be as real in the present as in the past. For Borg, he said Easter, the meaning of Easter gradually emerged over years and years as the disciples reflected upon the teachings and the things that had happened in Jesus' lifetime. As they told those stories and retold them and reflected on them, the meaning of Easter began to emerge. Easter, it's no accident that the stories of Easter are set at dawn. The meaning of Easter dawns slowly. In fact, I would say that it is still dawning upon us. It's a story about coming back to life, but not in the sense of resuscitating a corpse or somehow suspending the laws of biology to effect the ultimate medical miracle. Now, don't get me wrong, to be resuscitated, revived, rescued, brought back from the jaws of death, as happens sometimes in emergency rooms or on beaches or battlefields. That's a wonderful thing. But that's not what Easter is about. The Bible includes several accounts of such resuscitations, and other ancient religious literature is full of similar miraculous claims. Whatever one may wish to make of these narratives from a historical point of view, the fact remains that all of those people who are restored to life in those stories, whether by Elijah or Elisha or Jesus himself or by some Greek hero or pagan goddess, all of them are simply returned to the status quo of a normal, mortal human life, which means that at some later point, they will die and stay dead. We might imagine that as a result of that near-death experience, such people would live the rest of their life with a deep sense of gratitude and a new perspective on the precious nature of existence. Certainly that's been true of people in my experience who feel that they've received a second chance and they live not on borrowed time, but what might better be called given time or graced time. But in the end, they all die. As all of us in this room will one day die, surely. Human beings are mortal animals, and we are conscious of our own mortality. What makes human beings religious, wrote the late UU minister Forrest Church, is the dual consciousness of having been born and having to die. We've known this for as long as we've been human. People back in Jesus' time were not gullible fools. It's a vain modern conceit to think that our ancient ancestors were somehow more gullible, easier to deceive, more susceptible to superstition, or simply unaware of the facts of life and death, which we, in our scientific age, are finally able to see with objective clarity. This is industrial strength nonsense. If anything, our ancestors were far more familiar with and knowledgeable about death than we are, because they dwelt with it more intimately. And they knew that dead people do not rise. They knew the grim biological realities. When Jesus instructed Martha to remove the stone from the entrance to the tomb of her brother Lazarus, she balked, saying in the King James translation, "Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead 4 days." No, we're the ones who are insulated and estranged from the reality of death. We've lost that intimate acquaintance with death that our ancestors had. And along with this, we've also lost what I call symbolic literacy, the ability to understand and communicate human meaning in anything other than literal, linear, and logical forms. Again, don't get me wrong, I have nothing against rationality, science, technology, and so forth. It's just that as certain of our human powers have grown, others have atrophied. And one of those powers is the ability to imagine, to perceive, to communicate, and to create meaning in metaphorical, symbolic, and mythical ways. We downgrade and denigrate what we no longer understand. We say that's just a myth, or it's only a symbol, or a mere metaphor, forgetting that myths, symbols, and metaphors have the power to disclose real truth in ways that transcend mere logical calculation. So Easter is not the story about the literal resuscitation of Jesus' corpse so that he might live another day, perhaps to lead a rebellion against the Romans, perhaps to run off to the south of France to make babies with Mary Magdalene, as Dan Brown proposed in his Da Vinci Code, or perhaps as in the imaginative vision of D.H. Lawrence's short story, The Man Who Died, he staggered out of his tomb, bleeding and exhausted, only to be nursed back to health and initiated into the mysteries of the goddess Isis by one of her priestesses. These are all entertaining fantasies, but they miss the meaning of Easter completely. The events surrounding Easter speak in symbolic language about what I call coming back to life. By coming back to life, I mean returning from the myriad ways that we distract ourselves, deceive ourselves, numb ourselves, forget ourselves, flee from ourselves and each other. We are distracted from distraction by distraction, in the words of the poet T.S. Eliot. Coming back to life is a remembering of what has been dismembered, a gathering together of the fragmented, confused, frightened pieces of our souls and our communities. It is a coming back to this very life, but with a freedom born of having transcended the fear of death. Not denying the facts of death, but having transcended the fear of death. The core teachings of Jesus revolved, and still revolve, around the idea and the practice of repentance, which means literally to turn around, to return, to come back to life. To paraphrase a country western song, you might say that we persist in looking for life in all the wrong places. And the message of Easter is turn around, come back home to the source of your own aliveness. The life to which the resurrected Christ invites those who would follow in this way is one, there's nothing special about it. It just involves the performing the same practices that Jesus taught during his lifetime, the same life-sustaining activities of sharing, celebrating, active neighbor love, compassionate healing, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Do those things and you will come alive. According to the gospel tradition, on the night before he died, Jesus gathered the disciples for one last meal, as they had done many times before. It didn't take a supernatural genius to see that the handwriting was on the wall. His days were numbered. And as he blessed and broke the bread and poured the wine, he said, "Do this in remembrance of me." And the Greek word translated as remembrance is anamnesis, which means literally the overcoming of amnesia, transcending forgetfulness. So what is it that we have forgotten about being human, about being alive? I remember Joseph Campbell, again, another one of those 20th century guys, in an interview with Bill Moyers back in the 1990s, he said, "People say that what we're all seeking is a meaning for life. I don't think that's what we're really seeking," said Campbell. "I think what we're seeking is an experience of being alive, so that our life experience on the purely physical plane will have resonance within our own innermost being, so that we actually feel the rapture of being alive." The great African-American minister and mystic Howard Thurman had many idealistic young people come to him for vocational guidance, including a young Martin Luther King Jr. And he always said the same thing to them. Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive. Because what the world needs is more people who have come alive. And in that he was reflecting ancient Orthodox Christian theologian Irenaeus of Lyon, who said, "The glory of God is a human being who is fully alive." Sam Keen observed that we celebrate enlightenment when we really should be celebrating enlivenment. So how do you discover what makes you come alive? It's different for different people, but it seems to me it always involves some relational dimension. In the biblical view, both life and death are understood in relational and covenantal terms. Simply put, life is inclusion and death is exclusion. The author of the New Testament letter of 1 John expresses the covenantal view well. We know that we have passed from death to life because we love one another. Whoever does not love abides in death. In other words, in such a covenantal view, life is understood and experienced as more than just a biological category. It is a rich relational matrix that connects us to one another in what we Unitarian Universalists call the interdependent web of all existence. The distinguished New Testament scholar Luke Timothy Johnson provocatively puts it this way, puts the question before us. The most important question, he says, concerning Jesus is simply this: do we think he is dead or alive? Now, before you rush to answer, remember what I just said about the relational and covenantal dimension of life and death. Life is larger than simply a biological category. Johnson's question, I almost want to call it a Zen koan, reminds me of another story with which I will conclude. It comes from a collection called Soul Food, Stories to Nourish the Spirit and Heart, edited by Jack Kornfield and Christina Feldman. It's a story about a young man who had just completed his spiritual training and moved to a new town where he intended to become a spiritual teacher. He hung out his shingle, but no one came. He learned that the only spiritually interested in people in town seemed to be all followers of a certain wise and well-known teacher. Overcome with envy, the young man devised a plan to embarrass the old master and gain students for himself. So one day he captured a small bird and went to where the master was seated, surrounded by many disciples. Holding the small bird in his hands and hiding them behind his back, he spoke directly to the master. If you are so wise, tell me now, is this bird in my hand alive or dead? His plan was this. If the master said the bird was dead, he would open his hand and the bird would fly away and the master would be wrong and the students would come to him. If the master said the bird was alive, he would quietly and quickly crush it in his hand and open it and say, see, the bird is dead. Again, the master would be wrong, and the young teacher would stand to gain students. He stood poised in front of the master, demanding an answer. Tell me, if you are so wise, is this bird in my hand alive or dead? The wise old teacher looked at him with compassion in his eyes, and he said, truly, my friend, it is up to you. So truly, my friends, it is up to us. We all hold that little bird hidden in our hands or in our hearts. Whether it is freed and flies, whether it lives or dies, depends on decisions we make, the truths we perform, the life-giving practices we sustain. To practice resurrection means to return fully to this life, to join in the chorus of the singers of life. Unlike the sparrows in Isley's little parable, I don't think we can ever forget the shadow of the ravenous blackbird at the heart of life, nor should we. And yet we know, in a way that even the birds do not, that life is larger than death, and that love is greater than fear. The spirit of life is a fragile, tender, utterly vulnerable, yet also remarkably strong and resilient force. And we have it in our keeping for a time, this fragile fledgling, this wild, winged life. Call it love, call it hope, call it Christ, call it resurrection, call it nature's way, whatever you call it. The liberating message of Easter is that we live and move and have our being in this spirit of life. Amen and alleluia. Our closing hymn